Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Speak Your Truth with Mark Ross podcast. I am your host, Mark Ross, and with me tonight is Jill Sitnick. Jill, uh, I call you Jilly from Philly. Jill, can you, before we get started, Jill, can you just tell the viewers where you're from and what you do?
You gave it away. You gave it away. I live in Pennsylvania. I'm actually about an hour south of Philly, but I totally understand the names rhyme, so you go with it. I'm out here in Westchester, and I advocate for psychedelic assisted psychotherapy because I went through MDMA therapy for PTSD treatment a few years ago. And I think it's important that people understand the clinical research that's happening and help dispel some of the myths around psychedelics and specifically this treatment for PTSD.
Mm, okay. So before we get started on the MDMA, uh, you wrote a memoir
Yeah.
and it's entitled Rescuing Jill, which so happens to be the title of this podcast episode for tonight. I called it Rescuing Jill.
Ah,
Uh,
that's wonderful.
so, in your overview, which it's on Amazon, which you're
Yep.
advertising the book, you wrote that at age 49 you were diagnosed with PTSD. Was that based on something that happened in the past, or more recent towards your that age that you were diagnosed?
That's a spectacular question. The PTSD, the origin of it was my abusive and neglectful childhood that I ignored throughout my adulthood because I was in a loving long-term relationship. When my partner Carl passed away, about 18 months after he passed away, and the widow's fog, which made me not care about anything, when the widow's fog kind of started to go away, the unprocessed trauma and fear that emanated from my childhood, it started swirling. And I wound up being in a panic attack over a work email that just made no sense.
Mm.
And um, talk therapy and my Wellbutrin antidepressant prescription were not taking care of it. And ultimately, my therapist diagnosed me with PTSD due to childhood trauma.
Can you go in detail about your childhood trauma, Jill?
Well, so uh, they're both gas, so I can talk about it. My father was a domestic abuser. My father really enjoyed beating up on women, especially women who didn't have any sort of power over him.
Mm.
So my mother and I we were privy to that throughout our entire lives. My mother was clinically depressed. She was suicidal most of her life. She actually tried to shoot herself when I was 5. She survived,
What?
and she actually continued to attempt suicide throughout her life. Even 2 years before she even passed of COPD, there was a suicide attempt. She was on multiple antidepressants throughout her life.
Oh my.
And um, yeah, it just was lots of neglect, lots of abuse, lots of housing insecurity, food insecurity. But I was a child of the 80s and Generation X.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew I had a bad childhood. I didn't talk about it. But in my mind, I was never in foster care. Lots of people had it worse. And that's a way a lot of PTSD patients actually kind of uh, don't give themselves treatment because they're like, oh, other people had it worse.
Yeah.
Everyone's trauma is their trauma.
Correct. Correct. There's no such thing as bigger trauma or smaller trauma. It's all trauma.
All
And
time,
what's unique about that trauma is that it's yours.
right?
Not saying that to be in a good way, but I'm saying it because it's real.
It's the
It's
reality.
your trauma. I mean, I've encountered people who had more trauma than me, than myself, but it's still trauma.
Yeah. And it's hard to delineate more.
Yeah.
My therapist likes to say we're all children wrapped up in layers. I mean, you can unwrap a layer and then there's lots more layers under and none of us escape childhood. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
guarantee there's lots of trauma out there.
Yeah. And some of us are doomed to repeat those
If you
errors
don't
too.
fix it. Yep.
Hmm.
Which is, I think, to be candid, all of my healing has made me realize just how damaged my parents were and their struggles. And they simply repeated what they grew up with. And
Mm.
isn't that sad?
Yeah, it is. And that's typically how it works, Jill. When you talk about, you're talking about generational trauma,
Yes.
where we learn trauma regardless if it's good or bad, but it's what we're used to.
Right. And if Generation X didn't have a clue about trauma, my parents' generation certainly didn't. And the generation before certainly didn't. I had a little bit of insight recently about my grandmother on my father's side behavior, because I don't really remember meeting my mother's mother. And just kind of thinking about how rough their lives were really gives perspective in terms of how my parents treated me.
Mm.
I think if you had quizzed my parents, they would not have really had an idea of just, I think they knew it was bad, but I
Mhm.
don't think they had a clue of how bad.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, yeah.
I didn't mean to freak you out with the gunshot there. Sorry. You asked.
No, no, no. I mean, I'm willing to dig a little deeper if you allow me. But I I I
Whatever.
I, I was just reflecting, though, Jill, about the generational trauma
Yeah.
aspect of things because I think many of us are reliving our trauma.
We're
And
reliving trauma from generations ago.
yes, and or we're 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 unconsciously impacting our kids via our trauma because that was what's normal to us.
Absolutely.
You understand what I'm saying? That
Yeah.
trauma became a part of you because it was your normal.
Absolutely.
Regardless
Yes.
regardless if it sucked or not, you took it as your normal. So now you're raising kids and you're subjecting these kids through a lot of unnecessary BS because you went through it.
Well, can I give a different reframe so
Go
that
for
people don't walk away feeling bad?
it. Hey, I'm just a
when
straight shooter about this thing sometimes. You know, you got to call it.
when we're little, we are sponges. We're all sponges.
Right.
And so we are absorbing how to see the world. I was beaten pretty regularly as a child. So I saw the world as a very scary, scary place because a toddler cannot understand that his or her caregiver could treat a child like that. So the child says, the world is a scary place. If the child or Jill never deals with that, I'm going to pass on to my children the belief, the absolute knowledge that the world is a very scary place. And it's not necessarily through any fault of my own because that's what I learned. And so that's one of the ways that generational trauma just continues until someone kind of says, wait a minute, in some way, shape, or form wakes up. I had a lovely long-term relationship. I knew there was something else out there. I knew there was safety. And when that relationship was gone, it's when it all kind of crumbled and reverted back to what that toddler learned life to be like. So it's I would say it's so subconscious, many of the beliefs that we absorbed that, it really takes, it's really hard to get to know yourself outside of those things that we learned from our environment.
Mm, mm. And
Yeah.
speaking of the environment, did your traumas have an effect on you uh, in terms of your relationships?
Well, so I'll answer that two ways.
Go for it.
Uh, I believe that most of my work ethic was a trauma response.
Mm,
I was thrown out of homes. I put myself through college. I had weeks where there was $10 in my pocket and I was eating Chef Boyardee and all that kind of stuff, which
mhm.
is still way better than other people.
Indeed.
And two things can be true. It was also very stressful and very traumatic.
Absolutely.
So, um, Why was I talking about that? Oh my God, I was just on the Chef Boyardee and I
Outlook
lost
on relationships.
my, oh, so I think that my intense work ethic was all about making money and being safe and having plans A through Z. Now, with that came a lovely long-term relationship. And there is research out there that for trauma folks or anybody, one relationship in their life can actually kind of make things a bit better. And that's what really happened. I had, a feeling of safety, a feeling of love that I hadn't really had before. And that was just a phenomenal experience. And I also incredibly independent, my own paycheck, my own plans A through Z. So there was a trauma response and there was also a loving relationship.
Mm,
I think sometimes our trauma becomes part of our personality and we just don't know.
totally agree with that.
Yeah.
Totally agree with that.
Yeah.
I can vouch for that because as a veteran that suffered from PTSD, part of my response to trauma uh, was
Yeah.
to work hard.
Oh, yeah.
Being from a military, having a military background, I came out of it, you know, dot your I's, cross your T's,
Yes.
make sure that your
Keeping you safe.
clothes is sharp, you know, haircut, the whole 9 yards. I mean, you got to look good, you know, feel good, be good. I'm hitting the gym 7 days a week.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
It
but
became your personality. Yep.
yeah, it did. But it also led to my not downfall, but it led to me crashing,
Burning out.
burning out mentally and psychologically, I think to a point too, because of I tell people when I got out of the service, there was no transition.
Yeah.
So when I got out, mentally, I was still back in North Carolina. I'm still in the Marines, right? And I'm referring to myself as a Marine still, even though I'm fresh out. I'm going to college, just got me a part-time job, but I'm still referring to myself as a Marine. I'm getting up every morning. I'm running, working out, right? Uh, just taking care of myself, which I was, but I couldn't adjust.
Oh.
So that became a trauma response for me as well. My inability to readjust to civilian life.
Absolutely. And that's there's a lot of training to turn you into a soldier. From what I hear, there's really no training to kind of rethink
Yes.
civilian life.
Yeah. So I would tell people look at it like this: the light switch never turned off.
Yes. That's a beautiful way. That's exactly what I hear from folks. Yes.
My light switch was still on.
Yeah.
So I'm still ready to go, ready to get that phone call
Hypervigilant.
all the time. My
Yep.
head was on a constant swivel.
Yep.
Didn't sleep much. I started drinking heavier because I was already drinking, but the
Yep.
nightmares started to happen. The night terror started to happen.
Oh.
So I called myself drinking at night to help me sleep,
Oh.
which that was my method of coping. I didn't want to admit to myself that there was something wrong with me, even though life was crashing internally because I couldn't readapt.
Hmm.
And part of me at one point wished that I never left.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah,
That completely makes sense.
yeah. So I went through years of uh, self-medicating,
Mhm.
self-medicating, suicidal thoughts, homicidal thoughts, because I hated people.
Wow.
uh, I couldn't, I couldn't, if I couldn't be in large groups like a concert or something, oh, my anxiety would be through the roof.
Mm-hmm.
And I still have trouble.
Because you couldn't protect yourself. There's too many
Too
variables.
many, yeah,
Yeah.
too many variables.
Yep.
uh, and I just didn't feel safe.
Absolutely. I totally get that.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, and I couldn't stand behind closed doors for some
Oh,
reason.
interesting. Okay.
Yeah, if the door was open, that's cool. But if it was closed,
So
nah,
no trapping, no
yeah,
getting caught.
yeah. And if we're and if I'm at a restaurant or anywhere, I have to know where the doors are. I have to know where the exits are.
That's that hypervigilance.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
oh yeah.
Yeah.
And I still show signs of that every now and again, but it's not as bad as what it was before. So
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, we talk about PTSD and the triggers and all of that. So I,
Yeah.
I hear you, and I hope you understand where I'm coming from too, because I understand where you're coming from.
I've been privileged in that I have never been in service. And I say privileged in that because I would be terrified. I would be a terrible soldier. I'd be horrendous. Uh, Absolutely horrendous. I was an English major. Like that's nothing compared to what you did.
Yeah.
And it's just we will I think probably talk about this. The VA I think was probably even more upset than I was that the FDA delayed approval of MDMA therapy. They just announced a $1.5 million grant to go ahead and study it on their own.
Mm.
I think they're frustrated too because the statistics I hear about veteran suicide, it's like what, 10 to 20 people a day, for goodness sake.
About 22 a day.
I mean,
A day.
a day. It's just, and we know that we have the research is out there that this could help at least 2/3 of those folks. And I think, and the VA is kind of strapped in that unless the FDA and the DEA make MDMA not a Schedule 1, how are they supposed to start treating people? So the FDA delayed approval saying we want more clinical research. The VA is like, okay,
Mm.
we're gonna give you that research. I'm like, go for it. Because
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not on the inside. My guess is they were frustrated.
Mm.
We can talk specifically about what I really meant by all that, but
Sure. No doubt.
I give you credit.
It's a mess. And I can talk about the VA system for hours, but I'm not.
Well,
Not the right time.
and I would say too, at least, they're kind of in a bind. They can't do a treatment with an illegal drug. So when the FDA delayed and said we need more research, at least now they're like, okay, we'll get you that research.
Mm.
Along with Lykos, but clinical research costs a lot of money.
Indeed it does. Indeed it
Yeah.
does. Speaking of therapy, did you ever go to treatment before this MDMA?
Oh yeah, I'll tell you the story.
Okay,
Yeah.
go
So
ahead.
when
Because that was
Carl,
my next question.
yeah, I had because of my mother's history, I had zero faith in therapy and therapeutic drugs and drugs in general. My mind is the only thing that got me away from my parents, so I was not a drug person or anything of that sort.
Right,
Um,
right.
I went to therapy. I met my therapist because of the grief. You can only rely on your friends so much. And so I treated myself. That's how I rationalized it. I treated myself to have somewhere to unload the grief. So that's how I met my therapist. Um, 18 months later, I have this panic attack. I give her a call. I'm like, I need to come in. Something weird's happening. And she had never heard any childhood stories because, again, the focus was on grief. So as soon as we started paying attention to why were my shoulders up to my ears? Why was my neck always hurting? Why was my stomach upset? Why was I not sleeping? Why was I suddenly 1,000% sure I was going to be living in my car in about a month? I was
Mm.
going to lose everything, which up here knew couldn't happen, at least not that quickly, right?
Yeah.
But my body couldn't. I couldn't. You're nodding. You get it. You just couldn't calm your body down. And so that's when we started exploring the childhood stuff. I was already on the Wellbutrin prescription because of the grief. And the talk therapy and Wellbutrin, months we were talking about the childhood stuff and trying to work it out. And I was getting worse. I was basically getting suicidal.
Mm,
That's when she said, look, I'm in a program to become a psychedelic assisted psychotherapist. Go take a look at this clinical research. At the time, there were two studies that had been completed, phase 2 trials had been completed over at MAPS.org, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. Because I initially was like, no, I don't do drugs. No. I went to go look at the research, and the research at the time, 2/3 of the people that went through the MDMA protocol no longer qualified for a PTSD diagnosis. And I wasn't getting better with the talk therapy and the antidepressant. I was getting worse. I trusted my therapist, and I saw the clinical data and said, I mean, what have I got to lose? I was already doing pretty poorly, to be candid. And so that's how, I mean, literally this therapy fell into my lap. And it was the protocol is 2 trained folks per client. So I had my therapist and her mentor in her program, who was a medical doctor at the time. So I
okay.
feel like I had the Cadillac of therapy, to be honest.
So there were two therapists present with you?
He was a medical doctor and my therapist, but he had been clearly trauma trained, like he knew trauma, but his licensing was actually medical um,
Oh, okay.
at the time.
Gotcha.
Yeah, but that's the protocol: 2 trained folks per 1 client.
Okay. For one client.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this is all on the MAPS website. You can read all about their protocols, how it all works. There's lots of videos. The company that actually submitted to the FDA is unfortunately, it's a for-profit company because, we're talking pharmaceuticals. It's the only way you can actually get stuff done. That's Lykos, Lykos. So they're the ones that technically got delayed by the FDA in August. So if you start looking and you're like, why does this say Lykos and why does it say MAPS? MAPS is philanthropic. They started the clinical trials, and then they had to hand it over to Lykos because basically they needed investors for the 3rd clinical trial and to be able to bring everything to the FDA.
Okay. And how long were you involved in this treatment?
1 year, 3 cycles. I started in September. My first journey, well, actually, we started in the spring because I had to level off of Wellbutrin. I had to get off of Wellbutrin. So we had probably about 6 months of prep in
Mm,
terms of talk therapy. And so the first journey was in September, the second journey was in December, and the third journey was in May. And by the following September, I no longer qualified for that PTSD diagnosis. I was no longer suicidal. The hypervigilance was gone. I knew the universe wasn't out to get me.
mm.
I still had trauma to heal. I was marinated in neglect and trauma. I continue to work on myself. I still meet with my therapist. But I very, very clear the suicidality, the
Mm.
lack of hope, the ability to feel joy, that all happened within a year.
So what you're saying about the worst case scenario thinking, I call that catastrophizing.
Oh,
When
yeah.
we're always thinking worst case scenario, and you are like the second person that I've been speaking with since I started this podcast journey to talk about that,
Yeah.
because
Well, it's a major
I do
symptom
that.
of
I
PTSD.
did that.
Yeah.
I catastrophize. I always thought, well, oh God, everything is going to just crash and burn, and
Yeah.
I'm thinking worst case scenario, but worst case scenario never happened.
But for all your listeners and all the viewers, if that's how you're feeling, go to a therapist because that's one of the major symptoms of PTSD, regardless of how it came out.
Mhm.
Battlefield training, child abuse, a car accident, an assault. That hypervigilance is one of the major telltale signs of PTSD.
Indeed, indeed, and I can tell you when I went, when I finally broke down and admitted to me that something was wrong with me that I couldn't control, I went to the VA. I told them my story. I told them what I was going through, and they referred me to, you know, counseling and got me on medications. And I went to group sessions and individual sessions, and throughout that journey, Jill, I met some really good people, and it really made me understand that I wasn't alone in this journey.
Absolutely not. Beautiful.
I
Beautiful.
was not.
Hopefully this conversation is letting some other folks know that too.
Indeed, it let
Yeah.
me understand that I really wasn't alone. I didn't have that feeling of being on a big ass island by myself,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
That there were other people on the island with me. And
Yeah.
some of us wanted help, some of us didn't really care, but we were on that island.
Yeah.
And I made the choice to say, you know what, screw this. I can't live like this no more.
I want to get off this.
I
This
want to
island
get off this
is
damn island.
fun.
I'm out. I'm
There's no resort here.
right. If I got to swim out this damn place, I'm out of here. You know what I'm
I'm
saying?
out of here. Yep.
I cannot do this. I
Yep.
cannot do this.
Yep.
So,
Very brave of you to admit. Yes.
and that was the hard part.
Yeah.
That's what took me so long, because I was
Right.
just avoiding. I was I was just masking.
Yeah.
I did it for years
How would we know to do any different? You
because
know?
we weren't even raised to deal with stuff like that. We
No.
we were raised in our generation, Jill, we were raised to suck that up.
You suck it up. Yes.
You suck
Because
it
what
up.
other alternative was there? Yeah.
You can't be soft. What you doing soft,
Come on.
come on, man.
Dust off the dirt.
Listen, you got tomorrow? Well, shit, I ain't worried about tomorrow. I'm worried about right now. I'm hurting right now.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. Good
but
for you for going and getting help. I hope that message gets out to anyone who's listening too.
that that's why I'm doing this, Jill, because I want people to know, hey, it's okay to not be okay.
Oh, absolutely.
It's okay to not be okay. I wasn't, and I
Yeah.
still I still roll with the punches. Just because I'm cool today doesn't mean I'm going to be cool tomorrow. I mean, I'm not going to worry about tomorrow. I'm
Right.
going to try and stay present, but just understand, not every day is going to be okay.
We
And
can
I'm
always
okay
get
with that.
triggered.
Yeah, indeed,
Yeah.
indeed, every day. But we just have to be stronger than our triggers.
Well, and the more healing that we do, the more we're able to say, oh, that's a trigger. I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to choose how to respond.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. And for some people out there, they're like, oh, Jill, you're crazy. I can't, When you heal, when you start to heal those triggers, you actually get to, I'm not saying like the horrible big ones. I mean, I've gone through some horrible big ones, but the more you heal, the more you are able to do a little bit of separation and say, wait a minute, why is
Mm-hmm.
that triggered? What's really going on here?
Mm-hmm. And you can decipher what's good for you and what isn't.
Yeah.
You can see it coming, can't you? You can see
It
the
just
BS
takes
coming.
work. It just takes work.
Yeah. You can see it coming. It's like, oh, that reminds me of something. I think I'm going to go this way. Because if
Yes.
I go
What's
this
this
way,
really mean?
right, if I continue to go down that road, it's not going to end well for me.
Right.
So I'm going to detour and go this way.
Yep.
That's what I've developed. It's like I don't know, a BS detector, I guess. If I smell it, I'm not going.
Absolutely. Trigger detector. Absolutely.
I'm
Yeah.
not going.
It's a good way to say it.
Yeah, yeah. But let's go on. I want you to talk about your memoir, Rescuing Jill.
Okay.
Talk about that.
Uh, I came out of the third journey. The third journey was MDMA with a tiny bit of psilocybin or magic mushrooms. I had had a horrible nightmare in March. So remember, my second journey was in December. In March, I had this horrible nightmare. And to keep it very short for this podcast, I was pretty much trapped in my childhood home where my mother had shot herself, my father had beaten us. I had this horrible dream about being trapped in this house. And through talk therapy and a lot of visualization, I was an English major. I do a lot of imagery in my head. My therapist and I couldn't get that little girl out of the house where the door was in real life. In my dream and my visualizations, there was no door. It was very, very weird, super, super weird. And my therapist and guide had discussed, if we get into that third journey and we still can't get Jill out of that house, let's consider a little bit of psilocybin. I had never done magic mushrooms. I'd never done psilocybin, but at this point I completely trusted my doctors and I was like, whatever, let's see what happens. And sure enough, that's what happened. We were about halfway through, about 2 hours into the journey with MDMA, and I have the transcript of that third journey in the book. We couldn't get Jill out. There was still no door. And so my doctors gave me a very small dose of psilocybin. And the visuals that the psilocybin mushrooms allowed was literally, and I'm going to do this with my hands, it was like a blooming onion, like my childhood home just kind of exploded open. And I found myself in a beautiful garden. I was rescued from the childhood home. So that's where the title of the book comes from. And I came out of that journey immediately knowing, usually right after journeys, you don't feel any different. That journey, I knew something had been done. My whole body felt different coming out of that journey. And I said to my doctors, okay, I already knew MDMA therapy worked because I had made such good progress, but I need to tell people this, because if you had ever told me that a magic mushroom could actually help a deeply subconscious fear, I would have been like, no, whatever. So that's where the idea with the memoir came from. And so you're in a sidecar with me through that year. And I will give your viewers a warning. If you were a victim of child abuse, you understand the book. It makes sense to you. I talk about my father. I go back to my father. I repeat things. Da, 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 da. If you are not, luckily for you, if you are not a childhood abuse victim, you might find the memoir a little repetitive and boring. But the memoir was never designed to be entertainment. The memoir was designed to show how that year was with healing. And sometimes healing and relearning takes quite a bit of repetition. The neuroplasticity that opens up with the psychedelics, you have to repeat that, oh, it wasn't my fault. My father was a jerk. Oh, it wasn't my fault. My father was a jerk. Well, to the reader, that can get, I get it, Jill. Well, so it was really, really interesting. But that was really the point of it. I wanted to explain the therapy from a non-research base, from very much a patient base. And that required telling my story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you just said something that really hit home for me, that I wrote it down. Healing and learning takes a lot of repetition.
It does. So if you think about so I was an English teacher for 10 years. If you think about the way that we learn, the flashcards, the repetition, when we study, we're going over things. That's the neurons in the brain. And this is the most elementary way to illustrate neurons. That's the neurons making connections and building more neurons. That's why we learn something better when we can equate it to something. If it's something brand new, that's why we use analogies all the time. Oh, that's familiar. I get it. So it's really ironic that when I'm remembering, what MDMA allowed me to do was remember childhood memories, a 3-year-old being beaten by a 6'2", 230-pound man. I remembered that as a toddler, that the universe is awful. I deserve it. I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough to love. Because that's what, remember, toddlers were the center of our universes. As an adult looking at this memory, and that's what MDMA does, it calms the body down. So I could look at this memory almost like it was on a TV screen, like it was happening to somebody else. And I was like, that little toddler, it was not her fault. That man was an awful man. That very idea sometimes needs to be repeated. It's kind of like a, oh, wow. But unless you think about it and make those neurons really work together, it doesn't stick. So in the book, I probably go back to that story 5 times. I don't know. In my journals, I was easily 15, 20 times referring to it. So I really want to just validate for anybody who's going through a healing journey.
Mm.
Repetition is your friend.
Mm-hmm.
It's there's nothing wrong. I really thought that I was like really dumb. I was like, whoa, why is this taking so long? Why do I have to keep going back to this? It's just the way that our brains work.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Understood. Understood. You also have, was it a podcast channel or
I have a YouTube channel,
YouTube channel?
a
Okay.
YouTube channel because I love to teach. And so I throw a ton of content up there. I'm actually shifting my content a little bit, so things look a little haphazard right now.
Okay.
There's
Okay.
a lot of information about me, my therapy, what it is, what integration is, like all the different terms. I'm finding that when people reach out to me, they're not interested in filtering through all the YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really making some like cheat sheet kind of primers for people now. I'll probably have that done by the end of December.
Okay.
I'm still going to be doing my YouTube, but I totally understand how people are like, Jill, not looking through your 200 videos. Like, just give me the information. Like, okay.
And you also have a workbook too, correct?
Yeah. Well, so if anybody out there is contemplating, now, to be very candid, my therapy was underground. I was not part of a clinical trial. And I know that a lot of people are doing a similar thing, and a lot of people are traveling out of the country where different psychedelics are legal. And I went on a uh, psychedelic tourism retreat, and I saw people get very disappointed that they weren't making progress or they didn't have the epiphany that they wanted to have. And they didn't have a therapeutic relationship with anybody. They hadn't really worked on their intentions. They were just like, I want my life to change. With
Mm-hmm.
psychedelics emphasize what is kind of going on. And so it's very, very helpful to have intentions. Um, I basically wrote in the workbook the 8 different ways my therapist and I came up with intentions. The body one, the one that we use the most often, that's free on my website. You can grab that anytime you want. That's even great for just regular talk therapy too. You know, listening to your body, what memories are coming up, what does that mean, that kind of stuff. So that's what the intentions workbook is, to just help people out if they're going to be going on their own psychedelic journey. Hopefully it is guided with somebody that is well trained. That's what the workbook is. You get to cheat. My therapist, I was like, hey, I'm giving out all the goods as to how we got this done. She was like, go for it. So there you go.
So, can you walk me through what a session was like for you?
Sure. Yeah. So think of it 40, 20, 40. 40% of the cycle. Remember, I went through the cycle 3 times.
Yeah.
40% is preparing that talk therapy beforehand. What are the intentions? What are you going to be working on? Building trust with who you're working with. Like, I would never go work with somebody that I, had an hour-long conversation with. That wouldn't have been safe for me. I had to have, quite a few times. The 20% is the actual day, which we'll talk about. And then the last 40% is called integration. Think of integration like the physical therapy. Like, you have to do something. You have to exercise, you have to stretch. You have to really think about what happened and really change your mind.
Mm-hmm.
That 20% is one day. And remember, everybody, I'm talking about MDMA therapy, not talking about any other psychedelic. I'm talking about MDMA therapy here.
Mm-hmm.
One day. A patient can be in an enhanced state anywhere from 5 to 7 hours.
Mm.
So it can be a very long day.
Yeah, I see.
MDMA is known as, on the street, it's known as ecstasy or Molly. And so as soon as you hear that, you realize it's not the classic psychedelic that gives you the beautiful visuals. No, you are completely aware of your surroundings. You're completely aware of who you're talking to. You, as a trauma patient, my body calmed down for the first time. excuse me, I was able to talk about how scared I was of my father, that I knew if he was in the room, he'd have his hands around my neck. Like I knew that kind of thing. Like
Mm,
that's how deeply I was scared of him.
mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of conversation. All of them were voice. No, I'm sorry. We had a technical glitch in the second one. First one and the third one were voice recorded, but always voice record them because it's literally your subconscious and you get to hear what you really think. The recording, I was as clear speaking then as I am right now. There's no slurring of words.
Mm,
And I will say that I talk in the book about the idea of for the first time hearing kind of my inner voice, like my intuition. Because most of my life, it was like, no, you have to do stuff to go be independent, make money, and blah, blah, blah. And I kind of ignored my intuition most of my life. And suddenly in this MDMA journey, I'm hearing this lovely voice, which is myself, saying, hey, time to live. It's time
yeah.
to stop being so scared.
Mm,
Uh, so it was a lovely experience. You know, Rick Doblin, who runs MAPS, once described MDMA as like a warm hug or like hot chocolate on a cold day. If you're taking the appropriate medical dose, that's how it can feel.
mm.
Yeah.
Hot chocolate on a cold day.
Yeah. Because it releases a bunch of serotonin and dopamine into the brain. And so those are the good, feel good chemicals. For a trauma patient, you're like, oh my gosh, I finally feel safe.
Mm. You can breathe.
Yeah. Yeah.
Nice, nice. What's next for you in your journey, Jill?
Well, I went through the treatment in 20 to 21, and I have since worked through psychedelic tourism. I've had the privilege of going to a couple of different retreats, and I've worked with a variety of different medicines to understand how they work with trauma. And I am in Third Waves. I have IPEC coaching certification, and I'm in Third Waves psychedelic coaching program. I just volunteered at an Iboga retreat. Iboga is one of the strongest psychedelics known. It's beautiful for addiction. And I had the privilege of volunteering there to get a lot of my hours for my program, which was lovely. And so I have a pretty broad experience base to explain how the different chemicals work with trauma. And so I'm making these primers to help folks. At some point, maybe in March, I'll open up my coaching doors for folks because I think there's a lot of people. I know this for a fact. There's lots of people looking for practitioners and providers and help and guidance. And
Mm.
as the legality in the United States moves closer and closer, I am happy to be an informational resource for folks so that they don't do anything dangerous to themselves.
Nice, nice.
Yeah.
What's your contact information so people can reach out to you if they want to?
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. Yeah, I'm thejourneysage.com, and there's a little calendar link, and probably starting January 1, you'll see a lot of the information I just talked about, the primers, and I'm making a little like a coaching companion to like explain that neuroplasticity stuff, because nobody wants to hear me talk about it over and over
Hey, you need to hear somebody, and that's okay. That's
again.
okay. Wow. Well, Jill, it's
Gave you a
been
lot, didn't I? You're like, oh my gosh.
yeah, yeah, you did, and you didn't disappoint. This was very, very informative.
Yeah.
I've learned a few things from our interview tonight. So, yeah.
And if can I just say too real fast, like specifically veterans, go on YouTube. There's a lot of information on YouTube about MDMA and PTSD specifically for veterans and also other substances.
Mhm.
Uh, you know, there's no reason why veterans, especially considering that horrendous statistic we mentioned earlier, should not kind of know about this emerging treatment.
Wow. Okay. All right, Jill. Thank you so much for being patient. Thank you
Oh,
so much for being
you called me Jilly. You had an in. You were in.
Thank you so much for your patience, and uh, thank you for taking the time to, just talk with me about what it is that you're going through, and your life, and your projects. And I mean, I wish you nothing but the best.
Aw. Well, thank you for having me. This was a delightful conversation. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And if you could, uh, just spread the word, spread the message here that, hey, this is what we're doing, this is what I'm doing. Just help get the word out, because we do need to have more conversations like this, Jill.
Yes.
You know, we,
Yes.
we need people to know that they're not alone. We need people to know that there are options out there, more options than just talking with somebody that they don't know.
Yes.
There's things that they can do to help gauge uh their their issues. I hate to say issues or problems, because that's a bad tone to me, but there's help out there,
Yeah.
and there's options, and we need our voices out there, Jill, to let them know that, hey, we're here. We're here.
But there's for some people, uh, what I talk about could be a viable option.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely, especially for veterans.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Veterans who are you do have to be screened. There are some precautions, so really do your research or reach out to me. Um, the same way you would never take just any medication without understanding its effects is the very same way you should approach psychedelics.
Mm, okay.
But
Okay.
thank you, sir.
No problem. No problem, Jill. And with that being said, my name is Mark Ross, and this has been another episode of the Speak Your Truth with Mark Ross podcast. Remember this: self care is important. So please make your mental health and your physical health a priority every day first. With that said, good night, everybody, and good night, Jill.
Take care.
All right. Take care now. Bye bye.